We should go ahead and get started. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Dr. Eng, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
I can get started, and I'm going to go figure out. We got some people still trying to get in. I'm going to go on the back end on that.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Georgia conservation voters. For those of you that may not know, and please forgive us for the delay, we have, I think, reached capacity. So we're trying to make sure we can do everything in our power to continue to let people in. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Daniel Blackman. I'm the former regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA Region 4, which includes, amongst 7 other states, the state of Georgia. I was appointed by President Biden in 2021. As of June of 2024, I left the administration as the first ever senior advisor for STEM. Joining us tonight will be a couple of people that were invited from the Georgia conservation voters. We'll give a brief overview and update based upon the information we have. And then I'll pass it over to Dr. Eng, who represents Georgia Tech and deals with atmospheric sciences, has a tremendous way of measuring the impact currently, not only from the chemicals that have impacted Rockdale County, but some of those remaining areas, surrounding areas. So as a first kind of kickoff, I want everyone to understand that from Sunday, what has been reported through Rockdale's various channels have been directed and led by what's called incident command. Many of you all may hear this, so forgive my redundancy, but I know a lot has been reported in the paper. Those who are coordinating the efforts right now include the EPD, which is the Environmental Protection Division in the state of Georgia. Collaborating with them along with Incident Command is the Environmental Protection Agency, GEMA, which is the Georgia Emergency Management Agency, Homeland Security, Department of Public Health, and also local agencies that are coordinating across the board, not only to keep people aware, but as you can imagine with the consistency over the last couple of days or the lack thereof with sheltering in place and having different recommendations that have come. Our goal tonight is to let you all know what we have been able to be aware of, to give Dr. Eng 20 minutes to basically give you a presentation, because many of you all's concerns is not just with the shelter in place, it's with public health. For those of you that don't know, EPA's main goal when I was there, and it still is the mission, is to protect people and environment. That includes your public health. Our concern is with the events that have happened over the last 72 hours, there has not been a lot of information as it relates to what chemicals outside of chlorine may be in the atmosphere, how to address those issues for many people that are addressing or feeling migraine headaches, sore throats, itchy eyes. I mean, people want to understand what is happening. And our goal tonight is to share a couple of updates from what we have, but also to let Dr. Eng know, to let her give you guys more updated information. One of the things that's important to understand is that there is an on-site coordinator that works with Rockdale's emergency management as well. And Rockdale, as well as the fire chief, who I think may be on, has been coordinating and doing a great job with helping to understand this space in general. What I wanted to share with you all really quickly is why this conversation is important to understand. Number one, the parameter, because what is being reported specifically in the first 24 hours was specific to the area impacted in Conyers. And I think it's important for us to differentiate what that means with the large plume of smoke that went into the atmosphere. The winds were just coming out of a hurricane. The weather pattern has changed. So I've already been speaking to my colleagues at the University of Georgia that's monitoring the weather, but also with Dr. Eng. And at this time, I'm going to pass that on. I have several more information to share. But Dr. Eng, I wanted you to go right into your presentation, the information you have, and give everyone an update based on the public health impact and your data that's not necessarily being reported, but what you can share with the community today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of the data that we have. So I'm just going to share a short presentation. Everybody can see my slides? Good.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Yep. So I will just quickly introduce the ASCENT network, which is the ambient measurement network that we're able to capture some of these chlorine and bromine containing particles in real time. So ASCENT stands for Atmospheric Science and Chemistry Measurement Network, And this is actually the first advanced ground-based aerosol measurement network in the US. And this is, funded by the National Science Foundation. And this is a large team effort in which we have many different steering committee members, including Ted Russell here at Georgia Tech, Endula at UC Davis, Royal Brionté at UC Riverside. And we have many sites. So all these are the different, site mentors. And we also have a really great team of software engineers who are making the database for all these measurements that are coming in. And so I would just have a few introduction slides just to kind of get all of us, situated in the air that we breathe. There are different constituents, and the measurements that we are doing is measuring for aerosols. And these are tiny particles suspended in the air. And you might be more familiar with the particulate matter, PM, because EPA, regulates PM 2.5 and PM 10. And so in my presentation, when I talk about aerosols, I was also referring to as particulate matter, these tiny particles. And these photos are just showing you that, they are very diverse sources of these particles, from exhaust, from wildfire, volcano eruptions, sand, ocean spray from trees, and cooking. Actually, cooking makes a lot of, aerosols. And all these aerosols could have, different impacts on air quality, climate, and human health. And our goal here is not just to measure the total concentration of the particles, but the types of particles. And I think that is important differentiation here. And so you hear me talking about PM 2.5 and PM 10. So maybe I'll show you, how small these particles are. So this is actually from the EPA website. So this is a strand of hair, like, your hair, and the diameter of this hair is about, 50 to 70 micron in diameter. And so out of these 50 micron in diameter, you can have these PM 10, maybe 10 of 5 of these PM 10 particles. So you can see these blue particles, they are PM 10 particle. And PM 10 means they are particles that are smaller than 10 micron in diameter. And now we have PM 2.5, which is even smaller. So PM 2.5 are particles smaller than 2.5 micron. So you can see this little cartoon here. There are 4, PM 2.5 in 1 PM 10, particle, right? And so this is just a cartoon to illustrate, how small these tiny particles are. And US EPA regulates PM 2.5 by several different ways in terms of the duration of, how much we are breathing in. So on an average per year, so this is the annual standard, it cannot be higher than 9 microgram per cubic meter. This is microgram per cubic meter of air that we breathe. And in the 24-hour standard, it is a little higher. So the 24-hour EPA standard is 35 microgram per cubic meter. And later we'll come back to these numbers because it gives you some context, of the amounts that we are seeing for this incident. But one of the first, I think, things I want to show you is that PM 2.5 is the total amount of particles suspended in the air that are smaller than 2.5 micron. But it does not consider the types of particles. So one example that I would like to give is that, for example, we have maybe about 100 people here, right? So we are all humans, but we are all very different, right? So the PM 2.5 can have different chemical components. So we can have black carbon particles, sulfate, nitrate, ammonium, and chloride. We'll come back to this chloride aerosol. But basically what we are breathing is not homogeneous. It consists of particles of very different chemical compositions, and these different types of particles can have potentially also different health effects. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, that PM 2.5 is the total sum, but it does not really consider the constituents of what is in PM 2.5. And so that's how ASCENT comes into play, and it is a new long-term advanced ground-based measurement network in the US, and this is a fairly new project supported by the National Science Foundation. Mid-scale research infrastructure program is a $12 million project funded by NSF. And I'm going to show you a site map. So we have 12 sites. You can see the locations of all these sites across the country. We have some red sites. You can see me here in Atlanta. So the red sites are urban sites. We also have some sites in the green color. These are mostly the remote, rural, national park sites. And so we are not starting these sites from scratch. So we are very fortunate to have many EPA actually networks hosting us, including Encore, PAMS, and Improve, many of these networks. And basically, these networks have been operating for many years, and they were nice and kind to allow us to, bring our instruments there to measure alongside with all the long-term measurements that they have been doing. And so for each of the site, we have 4 instruments. So, 48 instruments across the country. And this is the new type of measurements that we are doing, in a sense that we get data every minute or every hour. So we can really, that's why we can see the plume, coming in and leaving. And so these are the 4 instruments we have at each site. You remember at the beginning of my presentation, I told you PM 2.5 is total. So these instruments attempts to tell you what is in that PM 2.5. And each instrument measure a specific component of PM 2.5. And so you can see the measurements of these organics, inorganic compounds, including chloride, particles. You can have trace metals. That's where we also measure chlorine and bromine containing particles. We have black carbon, brown carbon. So black carbon, imagine you drive behind a diesel truck, all the soot, particles emitted. So these are black carbon particles. And we also do size distribution measurements because depending on the size of the particle, we can get into different parts of your body and make you sick. Majority of these instruments are measuring PM 2.5 because right now the EPA regulation is for PM 2.5. And so just to give you an idea where we are measuring, so this is a map, and you can see where the Metro Atlanta is. This is Conyers, and this is our site in South DeKalb. And so if the wind blows in this direction, if you can see my arrow, then you'll be able to actually, we'll be measuring, at our South DeKalb site. As I mentioned, all of these ascent sites are very fortunate to be situated on many of the EPA sites. So this site is actually run by the Georgia EPD, and it has been measuring ozone since the 1970s. And this is the trailer that we put our instruments in at that site. And this is just a photo of inside our trailer showing you where all the 4 instruments I showed in the previous slide were installed. And this is the preliminary data that I share with the press and then public in the last 2 days. And I'll walk you through what these data are showing. So the x-axis is time, right? So you can see that, we measure these pollutant concentrations continuously, as I show in the previous slide, every minute or every hour. And first of all, let's take a look at the PM 2.5. Because PM 2.5 is what EPA regulates. And an EPD, they do have, continuous measurement of PM 2.5. And as you can see, generally is pretty low level, maybe about, 6 microgram per cubic meter, increasing a little bit, on September 30th. But then you can see this really big jump on Monday, yesterday. We are seeing up to, 63 microgram per cubic meter of total PM 2.5. And so the question is, what are in these PM 2.5? What kind of particles are we breathing for these PM 2.5? So first of all, I think everyone is concerned about this. So there's this chlorine containing particles, and you can see that before this plume comes, we are basically at 0, right? And then when this plume comes, this is about 8 o'clock yesterday morning. This is starting to increase, and then by 9 o'clock, it peaked. And this unit is, 1,400 nanogram per cubic meter. And that's where you can find the article like mentioning that, the concentration increased by, 1,400 times for these chlorine containing particles. And this is the bromine, a smaller increase, down here. And then this is 9 o'clock, and then 10, 11, by 12, it pretty much, went down to close to, background level. And one of the things to look at here is that at the same time of these, chlorine containing particles, note the number, this is 1.4, but we have 47, microgram per cubic meter of these organic aerosol. And we would have to do more analysis to really see what these organic, aerosols are. But the good thing is that over time, it also, go down to, closer to background level. And just to give you some, context, what these numbers mean, right? So you remember at the beginning, I say EPA regulate annual PM 2.5 level, 24-hour level. So we can just take a look at the 24-hour level. So from 12 p.m. on September 29 all the way to 12 p.m. on September 30th. That's a 20 hours window, right? So I calculated during this time window, the average PM 2.5 is about 10 microgram. So if you compare to this number, so we are still within the EPA safety guideline, at least within the EPA standard. 10 is still lower than 30. But one thing to question or to consider is that the EPA standard does not really consider the composition of the particles. So if some of these particles are more toxic, than the other particles, then that is something to consider. But overall, the PM 2.5 is still lower than the EPA standard.
And
so
Dr. Ang, just really quickly, for those that may not understand from a scientific background, and I'm going to kind of give them like the health-based action level that they can then go in and refer to. Can you explain to them, because many of us are just hearing about the chlorine. So when you look at the chemical composition there in this particular area, for those of you that don't know, this facility was creating chemicals that cleans pools. So think of the chlorine that goes into your pools and the chemicals that help clean them. So when you talk about that amount of chemicals, can you explain to them in detail, especially for seniors that may have respiratory illness or people that are experiencing different, irritations, what does that mean specific to what your data is showing?
Yeah, so one thing to differentiate is that our data are measuring the particles. So, chlorine itself is an irritant, right? So if you breathe in, higher levels of chlorine, then it can irritate your lungs and throat and mouth. And so as far as I understand, EPA has been doing some chlorine measurements near a facility, at different stations around the Conyers area. So these are particles. These are, in the PM 2.5. So one thing to consider is that this is, 1.4 microgram per cubic meter, and it is still, much lower than the EPA standard of that, 35 or even 9 microgram per cubic meter. But another thing to think about is that, to my understanding, the emission is not just chlorine gas. There's hydrochloric acid. So what we are breathing is a result of several things, including chemistry and meteorology. So what our data show here is that there's actually some chemistry going on. If we actually zoom in here, we are seeing some compound called ammonium chloride. So ammonium chloride can actually be formed from the reaction of hydrochloric acid and ammonia in the air. So at least our data is, showing that there could be some chemistry of these hydrochloric acid in the air once after it has been emitted. And then if you want to learn more, you can go to our website. So this website gives you all the information, mostly what I presented in terms of the instruments that we use, all the 12 sites. And we're trying to, keep up with our X. Like I have some students, showing some updates of the data, so you can, follow us. And I'll be happy to answer, questions that you might have.
Yeah, and before you answer questions, because one, and I want to say thank you, because a lot of the information is scientific. What I want to first say is BioLabs, before we go into this data, I had a chance to meet with Congressman Johnson's office. We've been speaking to each of the entities from the EPD to the EPA. The first concern and flag for the community here, if you don't know, BioLabs have had 3 violations in the past 7 years that are at a scope where they have been either disciplined, or there have been things in place that have had to be changed for them to be in compliance. What that means is that if you look at the track record of it and you look at the proximity of the communities in which they are, the challenge we have is where the actual testing and the data it's being shared. So one of the things that we're concerned with is not only do they have those 3 violations in 7 years, they have 4 total in 20 at some of their other sites. One reference before anyone asks questions, we have Brionté McCorkle that's going to give an update. Anyone can go online and look at what's called health-based action levels. So anyone that's on, please write down health-based action levels. What that will allow you to understand is with where you are and your concerns in your community, especially, for example, if you're in South Gwinnett, if you're in DeKalb County, or if you are in Conyers, you should be able to understand based online when they talk about sheltering in place. It's very important for you to understand what those levels should be. So a lot of what Dr. Ang just showed you was based on how those measurements are happening. And what we need to understand is the levels at which is being reported so that you all can protect your children and your families. For example, a lot of the calls that I've received have come specifically from men and women, parents that are sending their children to school. And if there's a shelter in place option, people are confused or confounded about why are the schools open or certain businesses when there's a shelter in place recommendation that's being made. One of the things that's important for you to understand is that there's an on-site coordinator that's designated from the EPD. I'll put his name in the chat prior to us closing out this meeting. But before I go further, Brionté, who couldn't join earlier, is on. She represents the Georgia conservation voters. And then once Brionté speaks, if there are any questions, we'll continue, but please raise your hand. And we have a coordinator from GCV that will acknowledge that question at that time. So Brionté, if you want to just, oh, you're already off camera. So I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone.
Hey, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Just to introduce myself, I am Brionté McCorkle. I am the Executive Director at Georgia Conservation Voters Education Fund, where we work on climate and environmental justice issues. Our mission is to make sure that Georgians have equitable access to the Georgians have clean air, clean water, eat healthy food, and live in a world free from environmental harm. And it's unfortunate that we're waking up to news of such extreme, contamination of our air, which tells us that we're not quite in that world. And that's why we do the work that we do here at GCV Education Fund. We want to make sure that y'all have the information and are empowered to effectively advocate for yourselves, your families, and your communities. And so the reality is that threats to our air and our water are very commonplace here in Georgia. What we've seen happen is that, there's an incident, it hits the news. If it's big enough, it'll hit the news. And then we're getting pieces of information on social media, some information coming from county governments, some information coming from our friends. And then there's just a lot of confusion about what's really going on, what the real risk is, what the real threat is. And a lot of the information is vague, conflicting, or inaccurate. Is the air safe? Can we breathe it? Who can we trust to deliver this information? These are all questions that crossed my mind and that we created the space to try to answer. And so we started with Professor Ang, who provided all this very helpful information on contamination. I just want to summarize that what I'm hearing is that, based on current testing, we are still in what the EPA considers a safe, safe zone. And so we are at 10, I'm going to mess up the measurement, but the number was 10, and then 35 is the unsafe amount. So we're still in what's considered safe. But of course, as Professor Ang pointed out, the EPA standard doesn't really take into consideration the different types of chemicals and how they might impact. And so it's safe, but there can still be obviously some issues, some irritants and things like that are not accounted for in that standard.
And maybe one thing to add also is that it also depends on where you live, right? So remember our map showing where our station is. So we are lucky to have one station in Georgia, but that is between, Metro Atlanta and Conyers. So if you live on the other direction, then we would not have, any information, I guess, in terms of knowing the particle composition, at this point.
So you're saying that people who live on the other side of the plant, there's no testing being done for that?
So that at least for the composition of these particles, there are measurements of PM 2.5. There are probably some gas phase measurement, but in terms of the data that I'm showing in terms of the particle, the PM 2.5 composition, because we only have one site in Georgia, and that is where, in the South DeKalb site. But one thing, at least in the South DeKalb site, what we are showing is that by yesterday noon, it pretty much, dissipated, mostly. And I think the key here is that overall is below the EPA standard, but as you summarize is that some of these particles might be more toxic than the other. And so hopefully none of you are being exposed, during that big plume of that high, chlorine and bromine containing event during the early morning yesterday, pretty much what we observed.
And one thing I'll add really quick, Brionté, because I want you to finish. I think it's important to note, I spoke to the director of the EPD, Mr. Cohen, and he had made mention early, and I want everyone to be very clear. The initial perimeter that was set was for the direct area that was impacted. And I am currently under the impression that that perimeter has not necessarily extended all the way into some of the concerns that we have on the phone. For example, I know there are people from DeKalb, from Gwinnett, from Atlanta. And so that perimeter, we are not clear. So I think the push that we want, and one of the reasons why we want these folks, you all on this call, is because there needs to be more transparency as to where this is being measured. One of the things that I know in my former federal service is that the safety and protection of the first responders is absolutely critical. So those who are testing that area, a lot of times are prioritized. However, that does not mean that testing should not or is not being extended beyond regions where people as far as South Gwinnett and areas in DeKalb are experiencing this. I've received probably 100 calls in the last 2 days from people that are not in Conyers, they're not in Rockdale, and they're concerned, but they're also having symptoms. So just want to interject, but Brionté, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that, because I think that's really what I wanted to pivot to was impact, right? So, all right, EPA says it's safe. All right, we got questions about that. It's not being tested everywhere we really want it to test, and the right things aren't being tested. So the question is, I saw a question in the chat. Is it, do air masks protect us from this? Should people be wearing air masks? I know that Rockdale County issued a shelter in place. What are the measures that people can take to immediately protect themselves from this air pollution? And, Daniel, Dr. Ng, I don't know if either of you have answers to those questions.
About the masks?
Yeah, do masks is sheltering in place, which is, the current order in Rockdale County, is that sufficient to protect communities?
So I'll start off, and Dr. Ng, please interject. Look, masks have a role that they play, but I think the challenge we have is we're still not knowing the exact levels. And we're, for example, in the chat, I saw someone mention about the fogginess and the plume that they're seeing. So a couple of things. One, when you shelter in place, it's in your best interest, even if you shelter in place. Unfortunately, and I'm going to say a lot of things that people are probably be upset about, but you shouldn't use your air conditioning units, right? And I know that we're entering into the fall, but even to use your heat or your air conditioning, you have a centralized cooling system or air conditioner or whatnot, that circulates that throughout your home, right? So one of the things you want to do is shut off any of that circulation. If you have to leave and you're driving, for example, when you're using your air conditioner in your car, you want to click the option that allows the air to circulate in your vehicle and not to draw air from outside of your vehicle. As it relates to the masks, it just depends, right? Like there are industrial masks that I recommend. So think back towards the pandemic, there were masks that people just, the regular masks that really weren't covering the totality of their nose and faces. It's very important to know that masks alone are not going to, for example, protect your eyes, right? So I think it's important to take every measure to protect yourself. One thing Dr. Ng said, and she may touch on it again, when you think of ammonia, depending on the levels of ammonia, that can completely irritate your eyes. And in some cases, when you inhale too much ammonia and or a combination of chlorine, that can cause other health impacts. And my biggest concern right now is our most vulnerable populations, especially those at our schools. And I think there was, when I spoke to Congressman Johnson, there are some youth detention centers that were evacuated, including some jails. I know there are vulnerable populations that don't have access to masks or the ability to not have to go into work. Right. So we are looking at each of those challenges right now. Dr. Ng, as it relates to the mask, I'll divert to you and see if there was anything else you wanted to add to what Brionté mentioned.
Yeah, so I do think that so EPA measures total PM 2.5 at various stations. You can keep track of those levels and compare it to the safe levels that EPA put out with the 35 microgram per 24 hour and 9 microgram per year. And masks can help, like if you have to go out, if you don't need to go out, stay inside. But if you go out, you can put on a mask. But a key factor is to make sure that the mask cover your nose, because these are tiny particles. Whenever there's a gap, that's where they go in. So if you wear your mask loosely, it doesn't help at all, right? So make sure to cover your nose and mouth and tightly, fit it on your face. And if you do have an indoor air cleaner, you can use that to also improve the air quality inside your house. And one thing, I could give another webinar on this, but one thing is that you do buy an air cleaner, please only buy the one that only has HEPA filter and nothing else. There's many air filters that has ionizers, electronic components, like lights and all these gadgets. Don't do those, because those can induce actually unintended chemistry. I did a lot of those during the pandemic. So those other cleaners can induce unwanted pollutants inside your house. So please just use HEPA filter only filters in your house if you want to buy an air cleaner. And another thing is that I saw a lot of questions in the chat that in terms of, where else are we measuring? So you might remember from my presentation, we have 12 sites across the country. And unfortunately, we only have one site in Georgia. But it was fortunate that this site, happened to be able to capture these plumes. And the reason we only have one of these sites in Georgia, because as I mentioned, this is really the first long-term advanced aerosol composition measurement network in the US. And we're using these 12 sites to demonstrate the value of these real-time particle composition measurement to protect human health. And I wish we had more sites, across the states in different directions, so we can characterize these particles in more geographical, spread. But at the moment, we just have this one site in South DeKalb.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Eric. Well, Brionté, did you have something you want to add? Because I'm gonna go to Erick Allen, and then I'm gonna come back to you.
No, I was just going to uplift you both. Thank you, because that's the immediate thing is what should people be doing? It sounds like people should be reducing their exposure to air as much as possible, staying in place, not running the AC, circulating air inside your car, and masking up as much as possible to protect yourself, knowing that there's still risk. There's still risk. Those are measures we can take.
There's definitely risk. And Eric, if you can come off camera, I'm going to go to you next. Ladies and gentlemen, document everything. When you look back to, for example, the Flint water crisis, and I'm not saying this in any way, shape, or form to compare both instances, because we do not know where we are currently with this, catastrophic incident that is happening. But when you look at that, there were a lot of symptoms people were having that they did not know to check in with a physician for. They did not know about the lead levels, for example. So a lot of this information is very scientific. And as these particles on a daily basis are inhaled or into your, bloodstream, it's important for you that if you are feeling migraines that are not going away, if your eyes are irritating and you're beginning to see just redness in your eyes, you need to consult a physician immediately. But I would ask every person to document that. Don't just have a migraine on a Tuesday and just, think you're going to take Tylenol and go away. Document every single symptom that you and your family is having. Make sure you're documenting it internal, whether it's with a journal or however else. Seek out a physician. Make sure you keep up with your medical records, because it's going to be important as we get more data, as we get more information from EPD, EPA, and the Department of Public Health, that as they release more information, you are aware and accountable to where you and your family are and how you're able to get some type of recourse, or to even know what steps you can take to further protect your lungs, your health, and your respiratory system. Eric, we're at our 15-minute mark. I know we've lost a couple of people, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time and leave some time for any other questions to close out. Eric, if you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I'll be brief. So Erick Allen, former state representative, who was one of the leading members of the team that was fighting the Sterogenics barred ethylene oxide situation here in Georgia a couple of years ago that continues today. It's a little bit different than this, but I first want to say that my heart is with you, and I'm in solidarity with all those that are impacted by this disaster, which is what it is. When these things happen, I know there's a lot of data. We're worried about micrograms and what's in the air and what's that. The reality is, when something like this happens, if we don't feel safe, it's a problem. We should be able to, with confidence, know that we have air, water, soil, everything that's clean and good for our bodies. So we find ourselves, once again in a situation here in Georgia where we are worried and concerned about the air that we're breathing. about the businesses that are around our communities and what the risk like this pose to our everyday life. So Daniel, I don't know if you have specific questions. I think with this, we're really early. I know I've had a couple of people reach out and talk about legislation that I either proposed or things that we did with Sterogenics. What I can tell you is that time will come. Right now, I think we're in a position of learning and finding out as much as we can about what happened. This is a little bit different than some of the other polluting organizations that we have in the state of Georgia. With Sterogenics in particular, it's a known carcinogen that is continuously emitted based on the daily operations. This is more of a point in time, a disaster. Not saying it's any less relevant or important, because once again, if we don't feel safe about the air we breathe, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But I think they are two different ends of the spectrum. But we also need to make sure that we are making those authorities. I know we mentioned EPD earlier. I don't know if someone from EPD is on, but EPD, EPA, all these different layers of protection that we should have. We need to make sure that this is something that stays in front of their radar.
100%.
It's not going to fade. We need to make sure we stay vigilant, stay on top of this. And everybody that's on this call today, I encourage you to sign yourself up as an activist in this mode. You are going to have to continue to advocate for yourself, advocate for your community. And thank you, Brionté, and your organization for pulling this together and always being on top of these concerns that Georgians have. But we have to continue to have these conversations.
Yeah, and let me say this real quick, Eric, because I want to ask you a question based on what you said. And someone asked about the waterways. Look, a couple of things really quickly. These things happen at such a fast rate, and I'm going to say something coming from a former position as a regional administrator that is not always in the best interest, because right now we have a deficit of trust. There's a lot of information going out. A lot of people already have their feelings about what's being reported in the data that's out there. Eric, I'm going to come to you, but the question I have for you is, what was the early process like that you thought was successful versus what you thought you guys could have done differently? And I want to come to you on that. But before I do, I want to let everyone know, number one, a full investigation hasn't even started yet. Right now, the public health and the impact that's being held is going on. And I've heard various reports about there being a fire on site, there not being a fire. I can verify based on the information that I have that fire had not been put out. And this is from conversations that I have had with senior leadership. Now, that does not mean that as of this call right now, something hasn't changed, but the way those compounds work, and Dr. Ang is still on the phone, the more water you add, the more it will cause a plume, right? So there is a lot that's going on that, I want you all to understand that this is a process that has not come to completion, nor has an investigation started. I will tell you that there will be repercussions as a result, because this same company has had violations 3 times in the last 7 years, as I mentioned earlier, and 4 times in the last 20 years total. This, I'm not going to say it was preventable, but I'm sure that there were measures that could have been put in place that could have made this situation more of a mitigated process rather than a crisis. So, Eric, I want to go back to you. If you can just take 2 minutes to finish that. I'm going to go back to Brionté, Dr. Ng, and if there are any other questions, we'll close out. But we want to be respectful of everyone's evening, and this won't be the last time that we bring the community together. So, Eric, if you can ask that would be helpful.
Yeah. So when you talked about what we did in the early process, the first thing we did with the Sterogenics situation is invite them to the table. I know at a moment like this, we're upset, we're outraged, but we also need to bring them to the table and let the community hold them to account. We were lucky enough to have the CEO of Sterogenics come to a middle school in Smyrna. We had an auditorium full of people and held him accountable with the community. That's number one, is the community holding the organization accountable. Secondly, is staying engaged. And I saw someone in the chat talk about the elections in November. That's great. I think that is a fair point to make. But I will tell you, kind of like what Daniel talked about, we've got an issue in Georgia with some of our authorities and regulation bodies not doing all they can to keep us safe. Let's just be honest. What I found through discovery with the Sterogenics situation is not only had they had multiple infractions in the past, but where the state had the ability to fine them a maximum of $20,000, they were only fining them $500 per instance. That is not doing all you can as a regulatory body to keep us safe. So EPD has a role to play in this, to do more to protect us and keep us safe. I also saw something in the chat about closing the plant. We have been fighting to get that done. That is the hardest thing to do in the state of Georgia. We have we're bumped up against what's best for our communities, and a governor who is just hell-bent on wanting to be the best place to do business. And we have to understand what that means. That means that businesses can do pretty much what they want as long as it's not catastrophic. And that's where that political pressure is going to have to come in. So like I said earlier, Daniel, everybody on the call, this is not a moment in time. This is going to be a sustained effort. And we have to take our environment and our healthy environment serious and continue to advocate for ourselves.
And I'll say this before passing it on to Brionté, this accountability process, ladies and gentlemen, it's very critical. You know, we're not here to politicize the issue. Erick is absolutely right about what is regulated and what's enforced, right? There are a lot of organizations. Some of you all live in South Fulton and you have experienced, for example, the landfill fires. There are a lot of areas that oftentimes have not been addressed the way they could, and a smack on the wrist to a company that makes tens of millions of dollars, $500 is drop in the bucket. So we need to make sure there's transparency and accountability, but also Erick mentioned bringing Sterogenics to the table. You guys have a fire chief that has been on every call that I've had with the congressman. I have elected officials who are on this call from Rockdale, from DeKalb, from Gwinnett. They have consistently asked to make sure, what does this mean? What is the measurement? What is being said? What is being done? So please understand that there is a group that's working. I think the problem that all of us have is the consistency of information. 1 minute it's a shelter in place, the next minute it's lifted, an hour later it's back in place. I think that consistency and that transparency is absolutely critical for there to be, number one, trust restored, but number two, to make sure that we know what the long-term, to Erick's point, is on how we are measuring health in the communities. And I'll reference not necessarily just with Flint, but like there were people that didn't really see symptoms till 3, 4, 5 months after the process. So that's why I said it's important to monitor your health, check in with your physicians, document what you're seeing in your communities. And I think that would be a tremendous lift to where you are and how we can coordinate together. So Brionté.
Yeah, Daniel, can I say one more thing real quick that we gave
really
to the people on Sterogenics issue is open up a note in your phone, whether it's an Android or an iPhone, whatever it is, and keep a running tab of symptoms when you don't feel well. Document the symptom and the date and keep that as a running tab, because you do not know when you will need that, whether you're being questioned by someone from one of the regulatory agencies, or if there's eventually a lawsuit or anything else. All of that documentation is going to be critical. So open up a note and keep a documentation of all of your symptoms that you may have over the next couple of weeks, months, years.
Thank you, Erick. Brionté, well, hold up, Dr. Ain, and then Brionté.
Yep. So thank you, everyone. And that if you have questions, feel free to email me, and we'll continue to keep track of these pollutant levels because we do have the real-time measurements. So when we log into our dashboard, we can actually see the composition of these particles. And I'll be happy to share anything. Maybe you follow our X, and then if there's any new events or new plumes coming in, we'll be posting new information there.
And I saw in the chat about information. If you registered, we should have your email. We will send information out accordingly. So everything you're hearing has been done in a process to maintain the respect of your time this evening. But everything that has been shared, we will have on a document, including the names. The on-site coordinator, for those who want to know, is a gentleman by the name of Alexander Conti. That's Conti. Alexander Conti is the on-site coordinator. Remember earlier I said there's incident command. Under incident command, you have Rockdale's emergency response, Department of Public Health, EPD, EPA, Homeland Security, and GEMA. So you have these varying agencies, and the on-site coordinator that represents the EPD is that gentleman, Alexander Conti. So you need to know the names of these individuals so that when we're reaching out to various agencies, there's a name, there's a face, there's a title, there's a responsible entity, so that as we ask questions, we can seek out the right responses. Brionté, you can give your closing remarks, please, and thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I appreciate everything you all have said. Please make sure that you all sign up, tonight, or, you've registered. We will do another, meeting to provide more information. We'll try to invite some folks from the EPD, BioLabs, all the people to come to talk at that meeting. I think the bottom line is we have some immediate next steps on ways to keep your family as safe as possible, reducing your exposure to air, and all the different ways which we outlined and we'll email. There's definitely a very clear call to document your symptoms, keep a record on what's going on as this process unfolds. And we have dropped the change.org petition calling for the plant, this facility to be closed down. So I encourage you all to sign up for that. But yeah, please stay tuned because we're at the very beginning of this process. We're still sorting out what the best call to action is, who the best person is to put pressure on. And asking folks not only to deal with this immediate situation, but for us to have better protections long term, for us to have more consistent and reliable information long term from these government entities like the Georgia EPD that are supposed to be protecting us. So this is just part one in our response. We hear the call to make this call bigger. We will absolutely open it up for more people next time.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you all for
And let me say one more thing. So just as a recap, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you for joining us. Remember, the health-based action levels is something you can Google, do the research, look at those levels. We'll send the information over from Dr. Eng where you can compare that and to the best of your ability, monitor it. As I mentioned earlier, the company is the chemicals that are stored and manufactured there are specifically, they're produced in China. And they are, and I know this based on my speaking directly with executives in this level, the chemicals are used for pool corrosion. Okay, so this is the chemical they use in most people's public and private pools to make sure that those chemical makeups can keep out any bacteria or anything like that. And as it was mentioned earlier by Dr. Eng, she has seen levels of ammonia that have maybe mixed with that. So we're going to monitor that. Those do spike at night. So we do see varying times of days that happens. Please continue to be aware of various impacts that can impact you. I saw somebody put in the chat their statements was so we're guinea pigs. I don't see it that way. I do understand your frustration. I think accidents obviously happen. Transparency is absolutely responsible for us to make sure that there are no long-term effects and that we can do as much to protect our environment, including those of you that may have gardens. What does this mean for community gardens? What does this mean for your produce? What does this mean for you all, when the dust, clears, no pun intended, what does this mean for getting back to our daily lives? Because Brionté did mention calls for shutting this facility. That is a process. And while everything is happening, we still have that fire that is, being mitigated. That waste will ultimately have to be moved from that area. So we're going to not only have to track the process, but that waste, once it is addressed, once the fire is completely out and they go through the process where I'm going to assume that will then turn to sludge, it will have to be contained. How will it be contained? Where will the waste go? These are all questions that we will have in the coming weeks. And I think it's absolutely critical for each and every one of you to I won't say trust the process, but as we said earlier, trust your instincts and communicate with your elected officials, whatever information we can share. We are not the authority in Rockdale. We obviously are coming together with, Georgia Tech, University of Georgia. We have Brionté with Georgia Conservation Voters, Erick Allen, myself. That group, that circle will grow. We will get this information to your elected officials so that they can ask the pertinent questions in their meetings. And if anyone else has a question or wants to leave any update, Brionté, is there an email that you can leave that if people have any questions or concerns to follow up with this call, they can reach out to one of us, if not more?
Yes, I'm going to drop in my email address. And you all can send questions to that address. Yeah, but signing up, getting your name on the registration list, signing up with GCV Education Fund, just more broadly. Let me make sure y'all have the link to our website. If you go to our website, gcedfund.org, and enter your name in the email field, you'll get on our newsletter and receive communications moving forward. So yeah, I dropped my email in the chat, and I also have asked y'all to sign up for our email so you can stay in the loop about upcoming meetings.
I dropped my email in there too. Look, thank you everyone for this time. Brionté, Paul, all the folks that helped to coordinate this call. This was recorded, correct?
Yes.
So I'm sure we'll find a way to share this. I dropped my email there as well. Look, we know that this is a process, and I hope that everyone can find some comfort in knowing that there are individuals working to coordinate these efforts. People like Congressman Hank Johnson, who has called me probably 15 or 20 times in the last 2 days. His office is doing a phenomenal job. The fire chief. There are gaps, and we need to address those by communicating, and more information will come over the coming days. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. Apologize for any technical concerns, people who weren't able to get in. We will follow up again tomorrow with the video recording of this meeting, and we will make sure that we get you in on next steps. Thank you, everyone, also who took the poll about what your priorities are and what you want to see moving forward in this. We will follow up with all the resources mentioned in this, email contact for the presenters, and links to the information provided. Again, thank you so much. I'm going to leave this open just for another 3 minutes. If you want to make sure that if you have any extra questions, to drop them in the chat, because it will save the chat for me and I can go back through and pull those and make sure you get an answer.
Thank you.